Hey class, welcome to week number 6. In this video, I'm going to go over the paper that's due at the end of this week, your policy brief paper. Maybe, if I can get the computer to work. Okay. So for this social welfare policy brief, you are going to continue the work that you began in exploring the social welfare problem. For this assignment, you need to have an understanding of the framework for policy analysis from the Gilbert and Terrell text. We talked about this earlier in the class before you started getting into history with Trattner. You're going to go back to the Gilbert and Terrell text and focus on understanding how it is that policy is analyzed and how choices are made regarding resource allocation. So you have a lot of flexibility in this assignment to think about how to format your policy brief, but no matter what kind of format you choose for it or how creative you get with its presentation, you generally need to include all of the following. You're going to describe a problem or issue. You've already selected one. I do recommend using the same issue that you've already started doing the background work on, so you can pull from some of the resources that you've touched on in your first paper. You're going to present and describe a few options for dealing with the problem or issue. And you're going to present and describe your recommendations on the best policy or program options. Depending on what your social problem is, those things could be legislation, it could be coordination of agencies, it could be the development of specific programs. It all depends on who your audience is, what the problem is, and the scope of where you hope that your recommendations are going to reach. So, considering the framework on policy analysis from the text, think about the way that resources are allocated and what kinds of choices we make all the time in deciding who gets what they get, how they get it, and how it's paid for. That's essentially the series of questions that you need to keep in mind when thinking about how to make policy recommendations. So for your paper, you need to ensure that you include the following. So when you're describing the problem or issue, think about how to define what is the social problem. You obviously are not going to repeat everything that you included in your first paper, but you want to think about how you can succinctly define and describe the problem itself, the scope of the current problem. So you're going to point to statistics, key pieces of information that show us the magnitude of this social problem. How big is this? How many people does this affect? How long has this been going on? Think about and talk about what the potential causes that people believe are attributed to this problem. Where did it come from? Who's responsible for it? Who is directly implicated by this problem? And what are the most serious consequences of this problem? If we allow this problem to continue, what will happen? Second, you're going to describe the options for a potential response. So here you're going to talk about 3 to 4 possible ways to address the problem you've identified through public policies or programs. These could be things that are already being done or that are being proposed, things that are placed on the table in public discussions. These could be things that you've identified in your discussion forum post already. These could be opportunities for getting involved in something on the level and the scale that you've identified this problem exists on. And then finally, you're going to point to your recommendations. So here you're going to discuss the options for addressing the identified problem or issue that you are recommending. So maybe you're recommending that an existing policy or program is changed or that a new one is developed. This all depends, again, on the scope of your problem and who you're targeting with this policy brief. So you need to kind of consider those 2 factors. How big is it? Who does it impact? Who does it implicate for responsibility? And who you're targeting with this set of information. So then you're going to talk about the ways that your proposed response are better than either leaving it alone, leaving it as is, as the status quo, And the other options that you've identified are potential ways to respond to this problem. So why is your recommendation the best recommendation? And then briefly talk about how your changes might affect the social work profession. So if you are proposing a new program, you may indicate that social work would be involved in fulfilling the mandate of this program, right? So you may need, professionals would need to be trained in how to implement this particular program, or would need to staff this particular program, or would need to be able to respond to the needs of this population. So for your formatting, this is a policy brief. It is approximately 2 to 3 pages long. It's going to be single-spaced, Times New Roman 12 point. This is going to be block paragraph style, and we'll take a quick look at some of the templates in the syllabus that should give you an idea of what a policy brief should look like. It's not intended to look like a quote-unquote academic paper. It's intended to look like what a professional policy brief might. You do need to include references for all of the data that you cite. It can be in APA format for the purposes of this paper, or it could be footnotes or endnotes where you cite the reference at the bottom of the page. So I want to just briefly point to one of the templates. So I want you to look at the templates that are available in the syllabus and the description of this assignment. But I just want to quickly look at one of them with you. This is the one that comes from the Women's and Children's Health Policy Center at Johns Hopkins, because it's a really helpful resource. It goes through some key pieces to writing policy briefs in a clear, concise, an effective way. So there's a couple of things that I want to make sure to point out. One is in this B, you will see an example of a policy brief. It'll show you a not awesome example, so the not so good policy brief. I encourage you to look at that and get a sense of kind of what the problems are, you know, when things are particularly wordy or long or maybe aren't clear. This will go through and explain in all of these sections kind of the problems of this particular policy brief. Then they show you a better example of a policy brief where the examples that are provided are a lot more clear. The scope of the problem is clearly defined. The problem itself is clearly defined. The author makes very clear what the impacts of this problem are and what the key areas of concern are. It goes from that background into this call to action and the very consistent or very concise recommendations that are being put forth in this particular policy brief. This resource also provides an exercise for how to outline your policy brief content, things to keep in mind in addition to the requirements of the assignment. So think about your goal for the policy brief. What's the aim? Who is it targeting? What are the key concerns that you have about your social problem that you want to make sure that people get right off the bat? So how are you going to get people interested in what it is that you are concerned about? And then figure out what the most important data is. Like if they only walk away with 3 points from all of the things that you're concerned about with this particular problem, what are those going to be? You need to continue to keep in mind that someone who's not familiar with the social problem and, you know, has proposals in front of them about many other social problems as well, may not care that much about some of the issues that you care about with this particular social problem. So you have to think about the most important data that captures the most crucial pieces of this problem and how to best convey that information so that it's convincing and kind of gripping for the reader. You're going to talk about the policy options that are on the table, and you're going to then talk about the recommendations. So this kind of helps you think through how to do a policy brief. Go back to this. Okay. So I want you to keep the following things in mind, and some of this comes from your, just the way it is, and some of it also comes from your reflections after reading and reviewing all of your papers last week. So I encourage you to always consider, and this is a work in progress always, but how to write actively and not passively. It's a challenge to say exactly what you need to say clearly and succinctly. When we are writing about things, sometimes we tend to want to be very descriptive and kind of embellish all of the details about the things that we're passionate about. But when it comes to policy and advocacy, we need to be able to say exactly what we need to say because we may not have very much opportunity to say it. So practice in your writing, being clear, being direct, saying what you need to in as few words as possible while still providing supporting data. So for an example of something that's passive, so with being in a place where there is a lot of rain, drivers were starting to get worried about the road conditions, so they tried to take precautions. An active or more active version of that sentence might be, drivers began to take precautions following the increase of rain in Baltimore. We don't need to really know about their process, their thinking about, safety. We don't really need to think about their worries about the roads, what they tried to do. We want to know who was impacted, what they did, and why, right? So the active version of this sentence is drivers, that's the folks who we're concerned about, began to take precautions. The drivers took precautions. Why did they do that? Because Baltimore started seeing more rain. True story. Okay. Second, make strong recommendations that directly relate to the problem you're identifying. So you want to make sure that your recommendations match your target audience for the policy brief. So for example, if you're saying that opioid abuse is a national epidemic that's affecting people all across the country, that we're seeing mortality rates increase all across the country, don't propose an increase to a treatment program in Chicago, right? So you want to make sure that the recommendations that you're making in this particular policy brief match the scope and magnitude of the problem that you're discussing. So is that a national program for, drug treatment and drug prevention, drug abuse prevention? Is it states' grants to make sure that treatment is available for all people? Whatever the case may be, your recommendation should match the level of the problem that you have identified. And also, don't be afraid to think big picture. We tend to think about programs and therapy approaches, but the purpose of this assignment and in this class is for you to think about things on a slightly larger scale. So what are large policies? What are kind of sweeping reforms that we could propose in this moment where we have the opportunity to think as big as we want and as an exercise? So I encourage you to think as big picture as you can, or as is appropriate depending on the problem that you're identifying. Always, always, always support your declarations with data. We all have a tendency to speak in hyperbole. So we all have a tendency to want to dramatize the situation because it's serious and we're seeing the results of these problems on our daily basis in our work, right? But if we're trying to advocate for smart, lasting solutions, we have to be able to support claims with actual data. So, for example, we can't say in a policy brief like the one we're working on, elephants are dying every day all over Africa, so something must be done, right? That doesn't say anything about how elephants are dying, what country they're dying in, who's responsible for the fact that they're dying, who's responsible for doing something, right? We can say something like, there has been an alarming increase in elephant slaughter. In 2014, 302 elephants were lost to poaching, and this number continues to rise. The government of Kenya must act to reverse this trend, right? So we can talk specifically about the government of Kenya, so in this instance, seeing that I should have specified that in the beginning of the sentence, but here we are. So specify who is responsible, right? Because we might, in the description of your problem, you might talk more about the elephants that are being slaughtered by poachers all across Kenya, right? You're going to point to the numbers to show that this is increasing, that it's something that's been identified as a growing problem, and you're going to signal that the fact that the government of Kenya is responsible, and you might talk about why that is, right? Why is the government responsible for stopping poachers? Why are, zookeepers not responsible? I don't know. So you want to think about kind of who's responsible, who it is that you are signaling with your declarations, and how you can back those up. And then finally, I implore you to proofread. There are examples in this very post of why it's important to proofread, because sometimes errors distract from our points. So read through your work multiple times, read it out loud. The people impacted by our social problems deserve advocates who can clearly articulate the problem and propose sharp, smart solutions supported by data. And that is exactly what you are becoming. So please consider taking the extra time to proofread, read it out loud. As you can see from this, I looked at this slide multiple times and didn't notice errors until I read them out loud, right? So that happens in our academic work as well. So as an example before we end, I just want to give a brief example of maybe thinking through a current social problem and ways that I might approach doing a policy brief with this particular example. So the social problem that I've selected is the forced family separation at the U.S.-Mexico border. So it's a big problem, lots of attention on that. So the data should be available for this kind of problem. So I might summarize or think about how to summarize this problem by saying something like approximately 3,000 children were separated from their parents at the U.S.-Mexico border over the last 3 months. While enforcement of immigration laws against migrating family units has existed for at least a decade, this recent influx of apprehensions is a direct result of a zero-tolerance policy announced by Attorney General Jeff Sessions this spring. U.S. officials, as a matter of policy, criminally charged and arrested adults accused of unlawful entry, separating them from their children before processing adults into the prison system. No guarantee for when or how they would be returned to their parents, reunified with their parents. So, in a summary of a social problem such as this, I could support all of these claims with data. Things are strong, you can make bold statements, but I can support that with data. You want to be able to support any kind of bold statement you're making. To understand this, and so you further develop the policy brief, right? So in order to understand this problem and kind of how it came to be and who's responsible for it, something like this may require a little bit more background, right? So for example, because some will propose to detain the families together as a response, as a potential response for this particular social problem, they would need to understand that there's already a 10-year-old history of a battle about family detention and whether that's a good social policy or not, right? And so without understanding the history around family detention, a policy brief on the current situation of separating families as a result of immigration enforcement policy may not make a lot of sense, and my recommendations may not quite meet the goals that I would have in mind as the advocate. So you want to include key facts. You want to include pertinent pieces of information. You're going to highlight key pertinent agencies involved. So in this case, I would need to talk about I would need to highlight the role of the Department of Justice in creating the policies around targeted enforcement and prosecution, criminal prosecution and civil prosecution around migrant families. I would need to highlight the role of the Department of Homeland Security and specifically Customs and Border Protection and Immigration and Customs Enforcement, in looking at the roles of each of those agencies in detaining, transporting, and actively separating children from their parents and transferring them to other agencies. I would also need to think about the role of the Department of Health and Human Services, specifically the Office of Refugee Resettlement, who has responsibility for the care and custody of children. I need to think about the executive branch, right? So the Trump administration, specifically to look at the impacts of executive orders that have kind of trickled down into this current situation. So I would need to think about all of those players as I kind of highlight the problem itself, who's responsible for the problem, how it's come to be, and also as I craft my recommendations. So then I'd also want to discuss the options that have been proposed so far. So I might look at and describe some of the alternative to detention programs with electronic monitoring systems that are implemented and executed by the Department of Homeland Security. I might talk about the fact that some have proposed family detention as a viable alternative to family separation as a product of forced family separation. I might also look at the fact that immediate deportations of people who have been criminally prosecuted with their children in detention or separated and reunified with other folks as a matter of policy. I might look at the fact that these have been policies that have been proposed, in some cases implemented, and I may point to why they're problematic, right? And so kind of in that brief overview of other social policies that have been proposed to address this issue, I would talk about, either that history has proven them to be problematic, or they're not legally sound, or they're inhumane, whatever the case may be for those particular options. And then I would make clear recommendations for what it is that I do want, right? So I might also think about, as I think about my recommendations, I, in real life, would need to consider the consequences of recommendations, right? So the both intended and unintended consequences of these recommendations. These might include, recommending the immediate screening and release of children who were detained in this particular zero tolerance policy process. I might suggest the kind of orchestrated connection between government agencies and organizations in civil society to monitor activities during the process of apprehension. I would recommend the reunification of families where parents have already been deported, and so that the U.S. government take full responsibility for ensuring that children are reunified with those folks who have already been deported. I might recommend coordination of between the Office of Refugee Resettlement and civil society to ensure that children who have been placed with sponsors are connected with supportive services in the community while they go through their immigration removal proceedings. I also might consider recommending better coordination between federal agencies to ensure that information is shared appropriately, that rights are protected, etc. So you can think about all of the different ways that we can recommend policy or programs or coordination or better use of resources in this process. So have fun, be creative, be sharp advocates. I really look forward to seeing what you come up with. If anybody has any questions, please don't hesitate to let me know prior to the assignment being due. Have a great week.